Todas las personas pueden escribir, pueden hacer cualquier cosa, se tienen que emancipar.
Ningún libro verdadero tiene ni una primera ni una última página.
Con el significado que se recoge a sí mismo.
I'm back, I'm writing short stories now, and but nothing set in the pandemic.
Cada vez que al poema se le imponía la palabra yo, sentía como si de golpe se hubiera metido en la camisa de otra persona.
Antes soñaba sapos con lentejuelas. Ese es el sueño más lindo que tuve.
Le dedicó la semana entera a quejarse y suspirar, pero el sábado a la noche me dijo: mañana quédate que tengo un plan.
Dice palabras que te ayudan a sobrevivir.
Ahí lo llevo.
Muchas gracias. Nos vemos pronto. Gracias.
Hola, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a la entrevista Andrea Wulf en primera persona. Andrea Wulf ha planteado en más de una ocasión que su búsqueda es entender la relación entre los seres humanos y la naturaleza. La autora de libros como La invención de la naturaleza y En busca de Venus repasará en esta conversación con Diego Golombek su recorrido para perfilar al gran naturalista alemán Alexander Von Humboldt y de qué manera conjuga el conocimiento científico con la emoción vital al momento de ponerse a escribir. La entrevistará, como dijimos, Diego Golombek. Diego Golombek es cronobiólogo, profesor universitario e investigador del CONICET. Se dedica a la divulgación científica en medios gráficos y audiovisuales. Ha escrito más de una docena de libros de divulgación científica y también escribe ficción. Esta actividad, como todas las del festival, son gratuitas. Si quieres colaborar con el valor de una entrada, puedes encontrar los links acá abajo en la descripción. Muchas gracias y que disfruten esta conversación.
Thank you very much, Catalina and Silva. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be in a dialogue with Andrea. I have to say that I'm a big fan of her books and some of her talks that are online. We don't have all of her books around because I understand that only 2 of your books, Andrea, are translated into Spanish. Of course, the Humboldt book, and more recently the Venus book. But your Gardener's Sage is not around, and I hope that your latest one that just came out, right, the Magnificent Rebels, I hope that we will be able to read that. But I would suggest that we concentrate on the invention of nature, which is the one that I read. I haven't read the Venus one, so I want to ask you about it too. And again, it's a real honor to have you around, and we hope that this, as in the end of the movie Casablanca, will be the start of a long friendship with Silva and Argentina, and that we will have you around maybe next year in a couple of years.
Well, thank you so much for having me. That was a lovely introduction. And yes, I would so like to be there in person. So you can definitely invite me. And the new book, Magnificent Rebels, will be published in Spanish in, I think, mid-November. So yes.
Great. That's great news because for what I've read some of the reviews in the Times Literary Supplement and so forth. It's a bit of a prequel sequel to Humboldt, right? Because you delve deeper into the Jena. How do you translate? How do you the Jena set, as you call it, and that was so important for our hero, right? For Humboldt. So I would like to ask you many things, but the first one is about you. Why, right? Why Humboldt? Why did you put yourself in his footsteps, and you didn't only write and go to archives, but you just traveled around. You went to the Timborazo, you went everywhere he was around. So what really really surprised you about, or what were you fascinated with before writing the book, and what happened after writing the book?
So I suppose all my books are about the relationship between humankind and nature in one way or another. And Humboldt actually popped up in some of the earlier books. So for example, one of the books, The Founding Gardeners, which is about the American founding fathers and how their attitude to nature shaped America as a nation, I originally included a chapter about Humboldt meeting Jefferson in Washington, D.C.
Yep.
And I kind of completely over-researched it. And when I handed in the manuscript, my editor said, well, that's a great chapter, but it has nothing to do with the book. So we deleted it. And I think Humboldt is mentioned with one sentence in that book. But it was the beginning, really, of my fascination with him. And because I'm German, I had heard about him when I was growing up in Germany. So he kind of came up again and again. And then eventually I decided that I really, he was just not letting me go. Right at the beginning of my career, actually, my literary agent, who was brought up in Venezuela, he said to me, "You're German, why don't you write about Alexander von Humboldt?" Because he had read about him as a boy, about his adventures with the electric eels and the climbing Chimborazo. So there came a time when I knew I need to write about him. But I was very glad that I didn't do it earlier, because he is, he works in so many different disciplines that it was quite good that I had written a few other books about, botany, astronomy beforehand. So, I felt a bit safer to kind of tackle Humboldt. And then once you begin with Humboldt, for me, it was very clear that I had to follow his footsteps, because I don't know how other writers do it, but in order for me to describe the landscapes that he was seeing, I needed to see the same landscape. So because I'm not a wealthy Prussian aristocrat, I did not, have the means to travel 5 years through South America. But so I did it.
You mean you're not sponsored? You're not sponsored by any king of Prussia or Russia or anything?
Sadly
too
not.
bad.
Sadly not. We all paid for myself. But what I did is I kind of identified the important places where he had been, such as Chimborazo, for example. And then I took his diary pages, the transcriptions of his diary pages, with me as I went up. And then, like wherever I was, then I would take out the diary pages again and read them again, so that I could really understand what he was seeing and feeling. And much of that probably didn't even, go into the book as such, but it put me in the frame of writing about him in a kind of meaningful way.
And that's very clear once you read your book. And well, your chapter from the Founding Gardeners found its way into the invention of nature, because there's a whole chapter on Jefferson, and the encounter is amazing. And the political aims of Jefferson are so clear when he asks Humboldt about the colonies and what's going to happen. Are going to be republics? I love that part. But something about what you just said about going in his footsteps and read his journal, there's something very special about your writing. This is not a biography in the traditional term. And there is something that relates very much to what I find in teaching science. When we teach science in university or school or anywhere, we teach science as if it had happened today or yesterday, but we don't go into the minds of the people that worked with that, right? What in psychology that's called theory of mind, right? To go into some other people's mind. And we don't use that. Like when we teach evolution, for example, in high school, and we talk about Lamarck, right? We have fun about Lamarck, the giraffes and all that sort. oh, he was so dumb. He thought that the little giraffes would inherit whatever the mother had. And we actually ridiculize that because we don't put ourselves into Lamarck's head to see what was going on in the late 18th century and what was his mind about. And what you did was exactly the opposite. You put yourself inside Humboldt's mind. And I think that's one of the main points of your research, that you're not just describing what happened, but you're describing what happened in a certain period of time with a certain circle of people that Humboldt would talk to. And that's very strange in scientific biography. What you usually have is the facts, right? A lot of archive work and then the facts. What you did was to become Humboldt in a way, right? To read him with the eyes of Humboldt, not with the eyes of a 21st century researcher. And I found that really fascinating.
Well, thank you very much. That's what I've been trying to do, but it's really nice to hear that it kind of comes across to the reader. So I don't invent anything. So I use, also facts, but what I do is I really need diaries and letters, because there are two ways of doing this. You can look at the work of someone, but you can also look at the work and their kind of private life, because I think I believe that you can't really look at someone just through their work. I mean, we all, work, but we also all are private people. And in order, I think, to bring a person alive, we need to look at both. And in Humboldt's case in particular, his work is his life is his work. So it kind of is so intertwined. And his travels are, they are the basis of his work, right? He puts his own life into danger. So I think that was very important. And for me, what was always really important is to create a sense of a novelistic description. So I try to do it as you would read a novel, but nothing is invented. So it's storytelling. And I've always tried to explain this, that, the English word history has the word story in it. So you're meant to tell a story. In German, it's Geschichte, and the word is Schicht, which means layer. So the Germans tell history very, very differently. It's like one theoretical layer after another.
Yeah.
And the English have this, I think, very long tradition of narrative history, which I really, really like, because you follow a person with their fears. But I also think what you also said, what I think is very important for me, is that you always put these people in their context of their time. So there's no point in judging someone just by the standards of the 21st century. You need to kind of look at the world around them. And that's what's quite extraordinary about Alexander von Humboldt, who, was the most famous scientist. He was an explorer, but unlike most explorers of his age, maybe we should say that he was born in 1769, same year as Napoleon. So during his time, explorers would normally be paid for by the king or a government. They would very often travel with a big entourage of people. But Humboldt paid for it himself. He traveled with a very, very small team. And unlike most Europeans, for example, he thought that the indigenous people were the best observers of nature, as he said. He respected their knowledge. So if we put him in his time, it's even more extraordinary what he did, because most people were not like that. He was anti-slavery. He predicted induced climate change. So all these things, which would be pretty extraordinary today, were even more extraordinary more than 200 years ago. More than 200 years ago.
And you definitely read that as an adventure novel in your book. I mean, that's really, and he's a hero, right? He's a hero that we traveled with him. We oppose slavery with him, and we work with indigenous people. That really works out really well. And there is all this internal travel from Humboldt, not only the external travel to South America and then to Russia and everywhere in Europe, right? He was absolutely everywhere. And you really tell it so nicely in this thing about facts that we just mentioned, that he was kind of like he believed, as you said in your book, that everything is facts, but not only description, but also explanation, also some pictorial facet in his narrative. And then once he is much older, he goes back to theory, right? Influenced by Goethe and his other illustrious friends. And that's a very good metaphor of science, I think, that you have to gather, you have to have questions, you have to amass a large amount of data, but after some time, you have to think about, well, what about this data? And in the end, when he goes back to Berlin, and you mentioned that very explicitly in the book, he says, well, now we have to think about theory. We have to think about philosophy, because I have all the facts, I've traveled around, and sometimes we don't do that in science, right? Sometimes we are so much in love with either theory or facts that we don't put them together. And you tell that in your book, that Humboldt was able to do that after a whole life of traveling and writing, I don't know how many thousands or millions letters, and knowing what was going on. He goes back to think about it, right? To go to theory and philosophy. It was not that much in fashion, right? We are thinking about the 19th century, which is the century of experimentation. But he decides, okay, now we have to think about this.
Yeah, so he laughs about scientists who just sit in their study. And he said, like, how can a geographer judge the Earth, the origin of the Earth, by just looking at the next hill next to his, out of his studies window? So the traveling is incredibly important for him. So he, maybe to kind of talk a little bit about where he travels and what he does. So in 1799, when he's 30 years old, just before his 30th birthday, he leaves Europe together with Aimé Bonpland, who was a French botanist, and they traveled to South America and spent the next 5 years traveling, literally crisscrossing South America. He never makes it to Argentina, but he arrives in what's today Venezuela. He goes to Cuba, and then he comes back to Cartagena, and then travels to Bogota, and then from Bogota through the Andes all the way down to Quito and then Lima. So 2,500 or 4,000 kilometers through some of the harshest, most difficult landscape, carrying all along 42 scientific instruments so that he can measure everything. And then from Lima, they sail to Mexico, and then they spent a year in Mexico, and then on their way back to Europe, they stop in North America to meet Thomas Jefferson, who was then the third president of the United States. And the whole trip took 5 years. And he returns with, trunks full of plant specimens, rock samples, 4,000 diary pages, hundreds and hundreds of sketches and drawing. And you mentioned earlier that he's also interested in kind of visual depictions of scientific data. So he is someone, and I think that's very, very important. He's a scientist who experiments, who collects data, who travels, but who also is what I would call like the founder of infographics today, because he is using visualization of scientific data to explain his findings. So for example, isotherms, which we find today on our weather maps, the kind of wavy lines there, he invents them. So before, a scientist would just write down a long list of temperatures, but that doesn't, you can't then see that something is global. So I think his greatest achievements are really that he describes nature as this kind of interconnected whole, kind of living organism where everything hangs together, from the smallest tree to the largest volcano. But also that he unites the arts and the sciences, because at a time when other scientists very much kind of separate those. And then also that he sees climate and vegetable and vegetations as a kind of so he talks about global climate and vegetation zones. So he's really, I'd argue, he's really the first to understand nature as a global force. And I think that had a lot to do with his traveling across South America. And then through his traveling, of course, then he becomes also the forgotten father of environmentalism, because he predicts harmful human-induced climate change. So all of this, I think, is really very much based on his travels, but also on his time in Jena, which is what my new book is also about, but where there's a group of rebellious thinkers and philosophers who meet in this tiny little German town, and he spends a lot of time there before he travels to South America. And it changes him from being a Enlightenment scientist who purely kind of relies on experimentation, rational thought, and observation. And he says, Goethe, Germany's most celebrated poet, gave me new organs through which to see the world. So he adds this kind of more subjective level. And then from then on, he basically says we need to use our feelings and our imaginations to understand nature. So it's a combination of Jena and his travels.
Talking about the characters that he met, my personal hero is Charles Darwin as a biologist. I've just written the script for an opera on Darwin in Patagonia, which will be open next year. I'm quite happy about that. But I was so much disappointed by the encounter between Humboldt and Darwin. And I think you were too, because the way you wrote it, Darwin was for sure. And it was nothing, right? He was meeting his hero. Darwin was meeting Humboldt, who was his hero, and he had always traveled with his book and with his learnings and everything. And then nothing happened, right? He couldn't talk. He couldn't tell him anything about the origin of species. And then he left, and that was it. I was really disappointed. I wanted more.
Well, so let's start at the beginning. So the Charles Darwin, who today is obviously much more famous than Humboldt, but Charles Darwin was very much influenced by Humboldt's ideas. So as a young man, he read Humboldt's book called Personal Narrative, which was partly a travel account and partly a kind of scientific treatise about his travels through South America. And it was a book that changed Darwin. And Darwin himself said, that reading Personal Narrative made me want to go on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. And on the Beagle, Darwin kept his Humboldt books on a shelf next to his hammock. And amazingly, these books are still around in an archive in Cambridge. And when you open these books, you can see how Darwin underlined whole paragraphs, how he wrote into the margins. And it's almost like reading like listening to Darwin having a conversation with Humboldt. And then so he goes on the Beagle, inspired by Humboldt. But then as he travels through South America, at the beginning, he kind of sees this new world through the lens of Humboldt's writing. So he continuously kind of picks up the book, reads what Humboldt has written about something. He also then, when Darwin publishes his own Voyage of the Beagle, it's very, very similar in style to Humboldt's Personal Narrative, because what Humboldt did is he combined evocative landscape descriptions with poetic, evocative landscape descriptions, kind of poetic elements with scientific descriptions and scientific observations. So it's this blueprint for today's nature writing, and that's exactly what Darwin then does in his Voyage of the Beagle. He also uses Humboldt's books as he's working on the origin of species. So Humboldt is his hero. And then when he returns from the Beagle, he's in correspondence with Humboldt. And then in 1842, he finally meets Humboldt. Humboldt travels to London. Now, Darwin is 32 at that time, and Humboldt is 72. So Humboldt is, a superstar. Everybody kind of, is in awe with him. So, and he's very much used to being at the center of all attention. So he kind of like shuffles into the room, and Darwin is so excited to finally meet this man who's grown to like mythical proportions in his head. And Humboldt doesn't stop talking. He just talks for 3 hours. And you kind of wonder, because in 1842, Darwin had developed pretty much most of his evolutionary theories. So, and Humboldt was also walking along those lines. So if they had, if you imagine if they had actually talked with each other during that meeting, but they didn't. So yeah, so Darwin was very, very disappointed. Humboldt didn't really very much notice, but and I was definitely disappointed, because you think, oh my God, what are they going to talk to each other?
Yeah, I thought that was actually a theater piece, the encounter between these two, the young one that just could listen. And there's something else between these two characters, which is they were very popular at the time. I was surprised. I think you say in your book that Cosmos sold like 20,000 copies in a few weeks or whatever, and The Origin of Species was also sold out in 3 or 4 days. That makes me wonder about the concept of the two cultures, the concept that it's a 20th century concept in which humanity has these two cultures, scientific and humanistic, and they don't talk to each other. But that didn't exist in the 19th century. Like anybody with some kind of education was eager to know what Humboldt was going to talk about, and Darwin and any other people that were around. So it was a very different kind of society, the one that read Humboldt and listened to him talking or whatever. It's very different to what we have today, in which science is very specialized, it's very technical, and we can do science communication, but it's not enough. There's really a boundary between science and the rest of the world, and that was not around in the 19th century, and Humboldt was one of the ones responsible for that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, actually. What I find, I don't know how it is in Argentina, but certainly in England and in Germany, is that already, kids at school at the age of 6 are put into these boxes, like, oh, you are very scientific and you are kind of much more creative. So I was, for example, always put in the creative kind of artistic box. And I was not very good in the science subjects at school, because I think I was just taught wrongly also. But so I became interested in the sciences through these people. But I think one of the big problems we have is that we have this kind of very sharp line between the arts and the sciences. And I think that's one of the big problems when it comes to climate change also. We have scientists and politicians kind of bombarding us with figures, statistics, projections, which is, all incredibly important, but no one really talks about, we're only going to protect what we love. No one talks about the kind of vulnerable beauty of our planet. And, I don't know if there's this very iconic photograph of Earthrise, which was taken during the Apollo 8 mission, where you can see like our, beautiful black and white kind of Earth hanging in the kind of blackness and vastness of space. And it's been hailed as the beginning of the environmental movement, because this was the very first time that we realized that we are, that this beautiful Earth is hanging there completely on its own, and we are on this together, and it's one thing. And that was kind of a realization that was carried by a sense of wonder. And I think it's that sense of wonder that Humboldt allows in his work, and that's really missing in a lot of scientific work today, because he really believed that in order to understand nature properly, we don't just need empirical data. And I mean, he loved his empirical data, otherwise he would have not carried 42 scientific instruments through Latin America. But he also always said you need imagination and feelings to truly understand nature. So the one didn't exclude the other. And you see from about mid-19th century, so he dies in 1859, and from about then you see a kind of how the sciences are kind of separating, how scientists are crawling into the ever narrowing disciplines. And then by the beginning of the 20th century, scientists look down on people like Humboldt and call him like a romantic scientist, because it was not proper science that he was doing. And I think right now we actually need those kind of scientists again to kind of deal with climate change also.
Well, we're going directly into nature and climate change. I was thinking about going later, but now that you talk about that, I was really amazed by the way you present Humboldt as the inventor of nature, and also this idea of everything is interconnected. Quite before the idea of ecology, and much before the idea of ecologism, right? And that's something that really explodes in the reader. Oh, so somebody was thinking about this. He was talking about something very similar to climate change when he says about the anthropic effect and he looks at what happens with deforestation, right, in America specifically, and then he thinks about what was going on in Europe. If he was so popular, right, and people read everything about him, why did we have to wait 200 years to go back to his ideas, right? You say something in the book, you say that there was this anti-German movement after the two world wars, but anyway, I mean, it was so strong, his point of view on interconnectedness of nature, on that we have to preserve nature and that we have to be active in this preservation, that I wonder how such a strong figure was forgotten in a way, in this sense, in the sense of ecology, climate change, isotherms, and interconnectedness. He's much remembered as an adventurer, as a traveler, right? But not as the founder of these ideas.
Well, so let me just explain a little bit more how he actually came up with these ideas, because I think that's quite interesting, and it tells you a lot about him. So he has no concept of this when he's traveling to South America. And as he travels through South America, first of all, he begins to understand nature as an interconnected whole. So this kind of living organism. Now, if you see nature as this kind of tapestry where everything is connected, you also understand that if you pull one thread, the whole thing might unravel because it's all interconnected. So this is how he begins. And I think it's also important for him as he's traveling, because he meets a lot of indigenous people who, of course, see nature as a living organism. So I think he's inspired by that. And then, so as he travels, he sees how humankind has destroyed nature, because he's not just traveling through like the deep rainforest. He's traveling through areas where there are lots of plantations, for example. So he sees that in particular in Lake Valencia in today's Venezuela, which was then a very wealthy agricultural region. And he sees how the forest has been, completely destroyed to make way for cash crops. And he sees how rain has kind of washed off the good top soil. And seeing this destruction of the forest, Humboldt is the first to explain the fundamental functions of the forest for the ecosystem and the climate. So he talks about the tree's ability to store water, to enrich the atmosphere with moisture, and also to protect against soil erosion. And so that's the moment where he first talks about harmful human-induced climate change. And again, he warns, as he travels in his diary, he warns about monoculture, deforestation, irrigation, and all the kind of devastating effects of that. So he, in Venezuela, for example, he observes how relentless oyster fishing has destroyed pearl fishing has destroyed the oyster stocks in the high plateau of Mexico City. He sees how the irrigation has kind of left the valley around it barren. And he's very clear about his criticism. He says, I think they're raping nature. So he's very clear about what he thinks. And there are moments when he talks about, where he says there might be a very bleak future ahead of us. He says, we might travel to, humankind might be at some stage able to travel to distant planets. And if they do that, they'll take their lethal mixture of greed and arrogance and violence with them, and they will leave these planets as, and he says, barren and ravaged, as we've done with Earth. So he's very clear about this. But the question is, why did this not become like a big political movement, for example? And I think there are several reasons. One is, although he saw this destruction, it was not way not as bad as it is now. So he was one of the few who actually saw it like this. Most people at that time thought a felled forest is something excellent because we impose order upon nature. We turn the kind of wilderness into good fields. We'll have crops. So the destruction of the forest is actually seen as something positive in the early 19th century. And the other thing is that Humboldt actually never became an activist, because Humboldt is so much interested in so many different things that he kind of does this a bit and this a bit and this a bit. So he never follows through really properly because he gets interested in something else again. So that's the reason why I have, within the invention of nature, within my book, I have these mini biographies about people he influences. So they take one of his ideas, like Darwin, for example, his evolutionary theory, or John Muir, who's the father of the national parks in North America. John Muir takes these ideas that Humboldt has about the effect of the destruction of the forest and then turns it into political activism. So it kind of almost jumps from him into the next generation. So that's one reason. But you also asked, why was he so forgotten? And I think there's several reasons for that. One is what we talked about earlier, that he's seen as a generalist, as a romantic scientist. So in the 20th century, you just don't do science like this anymore. You don't talk about your emotions. You don't talk about imagination. Then you have World War I and World War II. So these are not great moments to celebrate a German scientist. And I think that's actually quite important, there's not a single big discovery attached to his name. So unlike Darwin, he didn't come up with a theory of evolution. He didn't discover a natural law. He didn't discover a planet. What Humboldt did is he took everything that was kind of floating around and he put it together into something new. But we've taken it so much for granted that we've almost forgotten the man behind it.
I see. Well, we haven't completely forgotten him in Buenos Aires. Just a few blocks away from my house, we have the Humboldt Street, which is next to Bonpland and next to Fitzroy and next to Darwin. So they're all together here in the neighborhood in Buenos Aires. In this, you talk about Humboldt as a young guy who was so much eager to travel around anywhere, right? To the rest of Europe, to Egypt, to Asia. And then quite serendipitously, he goes to Spain and is able to go to America. Do you think there is something lucky in this? Like, what if he had traveled to Egypt or to Russia to start with? Would we have another kind of theory? We wouldn't have the theories of ecology, of interconnectedness, or these were ideas that he was incubating, and anywhere he would travel, he would go with the same ending.
Well, I think it would have been a very different story, because the extraordinary thing for him about traveling through South America was really the Andes, so climbing through mountains that are very close to the equator. And that was something that opened up his eyes to this nature being this interconnected whole. And one very important moment was when he climbed Chimborazo, which sits almost exactly on the equator, not quite, but so he climbs Chimborazo in 1802, and it's a very difficult climb. It was then believed to be the highest mountain at almost 6,300 meters. And he, as he had walked from Bogota towards Quito and then Lima, he literally climbed every reachable volcano. But the crown of his obsession was, of course, Chimborazo. So they struggle up. It's a very, very hard climb. It's cold, it snows, their hands and feet are kind of like half frozen. They really struggle to breathe in the thin air, but nevertheless, he stops every few hundred yards. He takes his scientific instruments out and he measures everything and notes it all down. So they climb up, and at around 17,000 feet, it was a very foggy day. At around 17,000 feet, the fog lifts and they can see the kind of snow-capped peak of Chimborazo in front of them. But they also see that they're standing right in front a huge crevasse. And he realizes that they can't go any further. There's no way across this kind of crevasse, and they are at but then they're at around 19,000 feet, so they're like 1,000 feet below the peak. And though they can't go any further, they've achieved something pretty remarkable. First of all, no one had ever been so high anywhere in the world, and they hold the world record for many, many years, decades actually. But what is much more important is that they, as he looks down on the mountain ranges below him, his kind of new vision of nature clarifies, and everything that he had seen before falls into place, because the travel from Quito up Chimborazo for him was like a botanical journey from the equator to the North or South Pole. So as he went up Chimborazo, he saw how different vegetation zones were kind of literally stacked up on top of each other, from the tropical species in the valley, like banana trees and dachuras, for example, all the way up to the last bit of lichen at the snow line. So, and he realized that many of those plants were similar to plants he had seen elsewhere in the world, in the Pyrenees, in Tenerife, and in the Alps. So he says, as he's up there, he says he was struck by the resemblance of the different climates in different places. And that was the moment when he realized that there were global vegetation zones and that everything was kind of hanging together. And that was only possible to see with a mountain that is near the equator, because you have the tropics at the bottom in the valley and basically the more northern climes further up. So I think that he ended up going to South America, which, as you said, was sheer coincidence. I mean, he would have gone anywhere. Was pretty amazing for him, because for what he saw there.
Yeah, and one of the mini biographies that you put in the book is that of Ernst Haeckel, that took Humboldt's idea and coined the term ecology. And talking about words and ways of calling things, in early in the book, I think you say that he was toying around, Humboldt, with the idea of calling this interconnectedness Gaia, and that is really striking. You know, it's something that we just came back in the 60s or 70s with James Lovelock's idea. So that's another quite interesting coincidence, that he was thinking about Gaia as kind of the Greek goddess that is the metaphor for everything is connected in ecology.
Yeah, he wanted to call, actually, what he wanted to do, he wanted to call his book Cosmos Gaia. Yeah. And and it's 150 years before James Lovelock's Gaia theory. Yeah, quite extraordinary.
That's really amazing. And something else. This is the early 19th century, maybe the mid 19th century, and we are on the verge of an industrial revolution, right? Of James Watt and what's going to become the industrial revolution. So, is that another reason why his environmental ideas were not as well as received? Because the industrial revolution does not want to know anything about nature or environmentalism, and then somebody is telling you, okay, for your machines, you need a lot of wood, you need coal and whatever. That's not good for nature. So a few decades after Humboldt's travels, there will be a clash between environment and industry, which we haven't resolved yet in the 21st century. So that might be another idea why his climate change ideas, environmentalism, preservation of nature were not as popular as they should have been.
Well, exactly, because at that time, obviously, it's a bit like what I said earlier with they would regard destroying the forest for fields as something good. The wilderness was something negative, was something scary, really. And I mean, he writes reports because he's also a mining inspector before he went to South America, which, by the way, I think was the reason why the Spanish king allowed him to go, because he could go and inspect the Spanish mines. But as a mining inspector in Germany, he would write reports about how steam engines would increase productivity, but they would use too much timber and there was not enough forest and timber around. So it's definitely that time was not quite willing to accept the importance of nature, but we are still not. I mean, we're still pumping oil up, and we know that that's not good for our environment. We know how terrible single-use plastic is, and we still do it. So we have not changed in more than 200 years. And although we have much clearer and much more precise predictions now, we still don't do anything at all. We know what's going to happen in the next 50 years, and still we don't change. So maybe it's unsurprising that people back then didn't listen to him, because it was not as bad as it is now, and we still don't do anything.
Well, you're completely right. Let me change subjects and go to you, to Andrea, as a writer, right? Because in a way, you're a historical writer, and you rely on archive working and reading, thousands of letters and everything, which is a genre, a literary genre that we don't have in the 21st century, right? People don't write letters anymore. But I think that the future Andreas will have a big problem into getting into the minds of their subjects, right? So I mean, how is it? How is your working day as a writer? Do you spend long hours, long days in libraries? How do you get archives? How do you get to private collections of letters? Because your book is the Invention of Nature. About one fourth of the book is notes and references and letters and so forth, which I found that fascinating. But I also thought, well, how could you do that? How could you go into so much material, so many letters, and does that put the fun out of writing, or is it actually more fun?
Not at all. No, I mean, so I love the research. The research is so much fun, especially if you do a person that's not that well known, because you actually have to dig through the letters to kind of find stuff out. So my days are very, very different depending on what stage of the book I am. So I've just published a book, so I'm actually not in the libraries or in the archives at all at the moment. I'm doing interviews and I'm traveling, so that's not writing. And then there's the stage where you do the research, where I become just I'm a hermit basically. I just go to archives, I sit there, try to find letters. Sometimes you find it, sometimes not. But I have to say, things have really changed. So I started writing 20 years ago, and things have really changed. So there are a lot of archives online now. So for example, with Humboldt, when I wrote The Invention of Nature, his diaries were owned privately. And then they were, just as I finished the book, they were, and we had transcriptions of the diaries. So, I had the content of the diaries, but I had not physically seen them. And then the diaries were sold to an archive in Berlin. And within a year, they had 4,000 pages. They had put them all online. And it's an amazing source. And this is the reason why I then wrote the graphic novel, because I wanted to use, because I suddenly realized that he's like sketching the whole time, because I had only had the transcription of the words, but I had not seen his writing in the diary, how he glued stuff together. So that became, I became completely obsessed and thought, I need to do a book that shows this visual aspect of him. So I think letters are very important, but it's honestly getting easier and easier these days, because more and more is online. Then once in a while, you will have to go to a smaller archive. You travel there, you try to convince the archivist to kind of get everything out for you. Sometimes they know and they don't tell you immediately. And then I have a database on my computer, so I transcribe letters, not always the whole letter. I read it and then I transcribe the bits that I need. When I'm allowed to take a photograph of it, I do that, kind of add it to the database, and then I keyword everything, and then and then at the end, while I do it, I think that, oh my God, it's so much work, it's never going to pay back. But then when I start writing, I can put in keywords such as destruction of forest, Venezuela, Humboldt, and I get all the letters he has written where he's described this, and I can see, oh my God, he's like obsessed with this for like 30 years, for example. So then, and that is very, very helpful for the structure of the book then.
I see. Sometimes it seems that these people in the 19th century were actually working for future biographers and writers, because they just leave everything on a page, right? They write all of their mind, all of their imagination, and you say that at some point when he was kind of older, Humboldt was writing about 5,000 letters a year, and I can't really imagine that.
And they were really long
something
letters.
You cannot think.
They were like sometimes 20 pages long. It's not like, hi, how are you? Like long scientific discussions.
Yeah.
He got so many letters at the end of his life that he wrote from America. He wrote to all American newspapers and said, please publish my letter. And in this letter, he said, like, please refrain from writing to me because I'm trying to finish my life's work, which was Cosmos, and I just don't have time to answer to you. I mean, because he was, he received in his life, we have around 100,000 letters that he received, and he wrote about 50,000 letters, and there must have been many letters.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but today we lose everything because we speak on the phone, we text, we write emails. Yeah. All of that is letters then.
Yeah, it's much boring, I think. So there is a connection in your literature from the founding gardeners, that you said that you had to pull out this chapter on Humboldt, and now to Humboldt's environments in Magnificent Rebels, which we haven't read, and as you said, will be translated and published in Spanish next year. So
no.
Can you tell me a little? In November this year. Oh, good. Even better. That's great. And I love the title, right? It's so rock and rollish,
Well, they were quite rock and roll.
That's the impression that I get. Like with the old figure of Goethe around, but all these youngsters like running everywhere and thinking about how to change the world, right? How was the environment in Jena, in the circle of Jena? And what did you find out that surprised you when researching for this Magnificent Rebels book?
So the Magnificent Rebels is a book about a group of rebellious writers, poets, and philosophers who came together at the end of the 18th century in Jena, which was a tiny little town in Germany. And these Magnificent Rebels were some of Germany's most famous poets and writers, and they might not be that well known anymore across the world now, but they were like the superstars of their time. And so I wanted to find the extraordinary. So as I was doing the research for Humboldt in Jena, I was walking through the streets and I saw all these name plaques on the houses with the names of the people who'd lived there, and I just couldn't believe it. And then even more extraordinary, I realized they all lived there at exactly the same time. So I wanted to find out why, and what I found was this story of radical ideas about the kind of creative power of the self, about the true meaning of freedom, but also about the unity between us and humankind. And they basically, what they did is they put the self at center stage of their thinking and gave it the most thrilling of all powers, which is free will and self-determination. So the French revolutionaries changed the political landscape of Europe, but the Magnificent Rebels, they incited a revolution of the mind that still continues today. And underpinning really this are two crucial questions. One is, who am I as an individual, and who am I as a member of a society? So how can I live a meaningful life in which I pursue my dreams but still be a morally good person? How can I reconcile my personal liberty with the demands of society? And when you look at the pandemic, for example, that's exactly this kind of tension, this balancing act that is at the heart of the book Magnificent Rebels, is the tension between the selfishness and the spectacular, breathtaking possibilities of free will. And in the pandemic, we had millions of us who gave up our basic rights because we believed that this was for the greater good. And then there were a few who said, no, my personal liberty is more important. What I'm arguing is that it begins in Jena. This is really the moment of the birth of the modern self. And the self, they put the self at center stage and has stayed there for the better or the worse. How we use it today is another question. So because we've undoubtedly become a selfish society, but they liberated the self with the intention of creating a better society. So it's a moment in time, 10 years, which I think is so incredibly important in who we are today. Because I believe that history is not a pile of old dusty ideas. I'm interested in history because it's, it gives us a perspective to the present. And for me, I'm interested in history because I want to know why we are who we are. And that's, with Humboldt, I looked at the relationship between humankind and nature in order to find out why we've destroyed so much of our planet. And with the new book, I look at us as individuals and ask questions such as, when have we begun to be such a selfish species? When did we think it's our right to determine that we are, that we can do what we want? And when did we first ask, how can I be free?
Well, what an era, right? Because as you just said, while these people were thinking about the self and these ideas, the French Revolution was in the terror years, and then came Napoleon and conquered the world. So it's mind-boggling to think about that time, right? How influential were these people? How influential were these people in Europe in the following century, like in the 19th century, the Magnificent Rebels?
They were incredibly important because Humboldt is part of them. They came up not just with the philosophy of the self, but also with the philosophy of nature. So, which is really what Humboldt also says, but also the philosopher Friedrich Schelling, which is that the self and nature is the same. So we are all one big entangled living organism. And that becomes this kind of philosophy of oneness is based on this idea that if the self and nature is the same, it means that if we go out into nature, it's always also self-discovery. And this becomes really the heartbeat of romanticism. And that becomes incredibly important. So these are the first romantics. It becomes important for the English romantics, for the American transcendentalists. They all read the works of the Jena set. And so Henry David Thoreau, for example, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, all are influenced by the Jena set. No one really talks about it anymore, but they were the first they were the very first to actually use the word romantics in its new literary meaning in their literary magazine. So they really kick-started something, and the effects can still be felt very much today. But I think for the romantics, it was important. For us today, the resonance for me is really that at a time when for long we've thought we are free. We're free to think, we're free to form our opinions, we can control our lives. But, at the moment, our democracies are kind of hollowed out, be that from, Russia's cyber interference in democratic elections or fake news, all there's so much happening at the moment, like liars, despots, reactionary politicians who just, manipulate us. So I think it is very important right now to kind of come back to the moment of the beginnings of the modern self, the modern free self, and our kind of heart-won self-determination, which is the reason why I wrote the book.
Yeah. So talking about romanticism, I guess that you have all of the ingredients to be one, right? You were, if I get it correctly, you were born in India, and then you moved to Germany. Now you live in Britain, and you traveled all around the world. Do you ever get the idea that you were born in the wrong time, in the wrong place, mostly in the wrong time?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I love the 18th century. The second half of the 18th century, I think, is so exciting. I don't know if I would like to live there. I mean, if I'd be healthy and well off, probably. I'm not quite sure if I wanted to be like a maid or a slave in the 18th century. But I would have loved to meet all these people and talk to them. So if I could time travel, I would definitely time travel to the last decade of the 18th century, 100%.
I'm sure about that, but we are very lucky that you were not born in the 18th century and that we can read you and talk to you today. So this was fascinating for me, Andrea. It was kind of a dream come true because I've read your book and some of your interviews and really love your writing style. And this thing about getting into your subjects and following them, it's very strange. You have to take the time and the effort to do that and the passion to do that. So on behalf of Filba, I really thank you for this time, and we'll wait for your next book, The Magnificent Rebels in Spanish, and whatever else you have to tell us about Romanticism everywhere, including in South America. So thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. Well, I hope I can come next year in person to Buenos Aires and talk about Magnificent Rebels. That would be fun. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. So now I'll switch to Spanish. Quiero agradecerle a Filba porque esto la verdad que es un sueño, hablar con alguien que lees con pasión, con entusiasmo, que admirás profundamente. Si no han leído La invención de la naturaleza, vayan corriendo, no tengan miedo por el tamaño, es un libro gordo, pero vale la pena. Es una novela de aventuras, escrita con erudición, sin duda, con conocimiento de causa, pero sobre todo con pasión por entender la cabeza, en este caso de una persona y de su época, que es la que 200 años más tarde nos trae hasta los mismos conceptos de cambio climático, de preservación de la naturaleza, y bueno, vale la pena reflexionar por esto, y Andrea Wulf lo escribe como nadie, y como han visto a lo largo de esta charla, es una romántica incurable. Así que muchas gracias.